Autofocusers. They do one of the most important jobs in astrophotography precisely, consistently, and automatically for you. QHY sent me their new Q-Focuser to review, so let's take a look at it. Hi, I'm Aaron and welcome to Alaskan Astro. Well, my last video kind of blew up. I think my subscriber count more than doubled in like a week, so welcome if you're new or if you've been subscribed from the beginning, or if you just searched for this product. This is going to be a more normal Alaskan Astro video where we're just looking at this one product, seeing how it works, maybe comparing it to some competitors, and just taking a look at it. This is the QHY Q-Focuser, QHY's new autofocus motor. For those who don't know, most astrophotography autofocusers are simply a little box with a stepper motor and the electronics to drive it. They're controlled by external software that just takes a series of images until your stars and thus the rest of your image are perfectly sharp and in focus. The Q-Focuser is going to be in direct competition with the ZWO EAF as well as the Pegasus focus cubes, kind of these budget model but still perfectly functional autofocusers. So full disclosure, QHY did send this to me for free just for a review period. No money exchanged hands either direction, and I'm free to say whatever I want about this. So when I said perfectly functional, let's talk a little bit about that with autofocusers. Reviewing an autofocuser is kind of interesting because, at least as I see it, it's really more just a yes or no question. Does it work or doesn't it? Can it consistently, mechanically get your images in focus? Now, we are going to look at things that make this stand out, like how it's connected, how it's powered, accessories that come with it, and is it easy or not to install on your telescope? So let's look at what's included in the box. Obviously, the focuser itself I took out already, and then we have the lovely cookie tin that QHY ships their stuff in. It's really one of the best parts of any QHY product. We got this nice padded box. We have this super nice, like silicone feeling, flexible USB Type-C cord that is for power and control. We're going to talk about that. We have a number of different sized flex couplings to connect the output shaft to the focuser itself. We have an external temperature probe, which is really nice that they include that. And this is something I really appreciate about QHY. They always seem to be really good about the included accessories. This is a 12-volt power adapter. We're going to talk about that because you don't need this, but it's a really unique optional feature of the Q-Focuser. We also have the base bracket plate that is how you're going to physically attach this to your telescope. It comes with all of the Allen key wrenches that you'll need. And then we have an entire hardware store worth of screws and bolts and things to get it attached. And that is what's included in the box. So right off the bat, let me just say that the build quality of this feels fantastic. It is really small. I'll show some comparison shots, but this thing is a tiny little box. All of the CNC'd brackets and parts feel very cleanly and well made. Everything fit together really nicely. It just feels really solid, and I can already tell just from the different bolt hole options and the way that these are built, it's going to be very cross-compatible with all kinds of different scopes. Then looking at the back side, we've got 3 ports. There's the optional temperature probe connection that looks like a little headphone jack. We've got USB-C, which, oh, thank you, the same port as everything else in the world, for 5-volt power and your data connection. So you're always going to use this port. And then this one is really interesting, and it's a unique feature to the Q-Focuser, is this optional 12-volt port,
which it's a tiny little connection, but they give you this adapter cable to turn it into a 2.1 by 5.5 millimeter like everything else in astrophotography, so that's fine. This gives you the option to add a little bit of extra oomph to the focuser if your rig needs it. I'm very curious about whether my situation is going to need or not need that, because I don't have the heaviest setup in the world, but my cold temperatures have often really pushed autofocusers to the point where they don't work anymore. I'm going to talk about that a little later as it related to my experience with the ZWO EAF. I'm really excited to torture test this in the cold. Now, I should mention that I am reviewing the standard version of the Q-Focuser. There also exists something they call the high precision model. The biggest difference is that it doesn't have an internal reduction gearing in the focuser itself, which they claim removes a bunch of the backlash. Instead, it relies on the dual speed side of the focuser on your telescope. The other biggest difference with the high precision model that some people may really want is you get this knob on the back of the focuser so that you always have manual control. For me, I don't really care, because once I have this mounted on my telescope, it's going to live in the backyard and I will never touch it with my hands. But some people may want that option to manually adjust things. I'm testing the Q-Focuser in Nina, and it turns, so that's good. I'll put it on the scope next. So this is 1,000 steps in Nina. We've got plenty of resolution to get our telescope in focus. I've been waiting a couple weeks for the weather to finally clear up so that I can test the Q-Focuser. And actually, I've been waiting a couple weeks even just for it to stop snowing for a day, so that I can take my cover off, bring the scope inside, and get the focuser physically attached on. So I'm gonna do that. Yeah, we've had a little bit of snow lately. I don't think that's supposed to stand up stiff like that. Oh, let's see. That's actually something I really enjoy about this setup, is I just have two cables to unplug, one power port and one USB, and I've got the whole scope off to bring inside. Nina, what are you eating? Gross. Come on. Alright, I got this thing installed, so I'm going to let it cold soak and then tighten things down a little bit so that nothing comes loose as the metal shrinks. And then also, while it's cold soaked, I'm going to test and make sure that the motor actually works. I'm just running off the USB-C right now. I'm really curious if that's going to be enough or if I'll need to get the 12-volt adapter and try that. It's probably going to be about 10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit below zero, so should be a good test. Good morning. It is 8:15 a.m. The temperature is negative 25 degrees Fahrenheit, and while I figure out some USB shenanigans with my mini PC, I'm borrowing my wife's laptop to try to just get a direct connection and verify that this thing works. So I know this is not the best review, filming, cinematography, but I just want to make sure that this device physically works in the cold, because this is a perfect cold weather test. So after a bunch of annoying driver troubleshooting and a real quick email response from QHY, everything is up and running. I spent some time outside with the laptop making sure that the hardware physically worked. It did. The issue is because I was running the nightly version of Nina. So it works. And right now I'm running the filter offset plugin, which just runs a whole bunch of autofocus runs, and it is just making these beautiful, perfect autofocus curves like I assumed the hardware would. It's a little bit warmer tonight, only like I think -10, -11 degrees Fahrenheit. So still plenty cold. I did try testing with and without the 12 volt plug-in, and it still worked just fine without the 12 volt. Maybe it looked like the curves were a tiny bit cleaner with the 12, so since I'm already wired up for it, I just kept the 12 volt power plugged in, and this is working really, really well. It is an autofocuser that focuses automatically. Little thing here, those teeny tiny autofocus steps, I am using an autofocus step size of 400, which is massive compared to what I was using before. The Backlash for overshoot, I just threw in 150, and it seems to be working great. Again, that number, as long as it is more than the actual backlash amount between your physical focuser and the motor, as long as it's more than that, it doesn't matter. If you've got it running on the right side, it only runs that extra movement once per autofocus run as it offsets, which is really neat. So yeah, this is just plugging along. I've got clear skies for the next few hours, and hopefully I will actually get to use this to take an astrophoto, which would be amazing. I realized I've been talking a lot about backlash without explaining what it actually is. Simply put, backlash is just how much all of the mechanical parts have to move before they take up all the slop in the system. This is most evident when things reverse direction and like all of those gear faces have to move before they recontact. Now you can reduce this by machining things to tighter tolerances, or simply by removing gears from the system altogether. And that's actually what QHY did between the two versions, the standard and the high precision version. The high precision version does not have an internal reduction gearing system, so there's fewer parts that have to remesh. So for instance, you can see that Nina has a lot more backlash on the top of her head before anything starts moving than she does out here on the snoot. So here's the thing. As long as the backlash is consistent, that is, that all of the mechanical parts have to move the same distance every time they reverse direction to start actually moving everything along, backlash isn't actually a very big deal. Now, of course, you can always just precisely measure how many motor steps it takes before everything reverses direction and actually gets started moving again. But Nina actually has a brilliantly simple method called backlash overshoot compensation. This GIF is doing a really good job of explaining what's going on, but basically it moves out past everything and then it does this overshoot where it moves the focuser past all of that backlash so that everything is all re-engaged again. And as far as the software sees, it's like there is no backlash because it's taken up all of that slop. The other neat thing is, as long as you have this set up in the correct direction, it should only need to do this, I think, twice per autofocus routine. Once at the beginning when it makes its really big move, and then once at the end when it sets the focuser to that perfectly focused spot. So I mentioned my experience with different autofocusers in the cold here in Alaska. Over the last 3 or 4 winters, I have used 4, or 5 if you count the DIY autofocuser I made, different focus motors. And the ones that I haven't had any trouble with were the Pegasus Focus Cube with the 12 volt input, this QHY Q-Focuser, actually both with the 5 volt USB and 12 volt input, though maybe the 12 is working a little better, and the old ZWO EAF with the 12 volt input. The only one that I have used that has given me trouble was the new ZWO EAF with just the USB 5 volt power. So I contacted ZWO about this to see if it was an issue or not, and they responded and said, "We consider this to be an extreme situation. The EAF is rated to -5 Celsius. Now, there's 2 things about this. One is, yeah, sure, my shooting conditions up here are pretty extreme a lot of the time. 0 degrees Fahrenheit is very cold. I acknowledge that not all gear is going to work in that temperature. However, the other thing is what they said, that they only guarantee the EAF down to -5 Celsius. That's around 23 degrees Fahrenheit. That's cold, but it's not that cold. And fair, I have had a 5 volt EAF work colder than that, but it does fail at a relatively reasonable temperature. But here's the thing, I don't know from model to model which one is going to fail at what temperature, and if they're only guaranteeing it down to -5 Celsius, that's not an extreme situation. There are lots of nights in lots of places in the US and around the world where in the winter, a clear winter night is definitely going to drop down below -5 Celsius. And ZWO doesn't guarantee that the EAF is actually going to work in those temperatures. So, all of that to say, that was the issue that I had with the EAF. I don't even consider running them out here because I regularly shoot down at like -25, -30 degrees Fahrenheit, and it's just not something that works. Maybe you live somewhere like Florida or Southern California where it's very rarely ever going to even get close to freezing, let alone down that cold, so this doesn't mean anything to you. I just think it is important information from my own experience that I am happy to pass on to other people. And probably for the purposes of this review, it's important to note that I haven't had any trouble with the Q-Focuser in these cold temps. It works great. So like again, I want to emphasize how nice this USB cable that QHY shipped is. Unfortunately, it's really long, which is kind of awkward. I had to wrap it around a couple times, but it is -25 Fahrenheit right now, and this thing is just as flexible as if it was on a warm day inside. One of the things I mentioned I'd talk about more is this external temperature probe and why it's neat that QHY includes one in the box. So these things do a pretty obvious job. They just take a temperature reading somewhere that is isolated away from influence of the electronics and the motor inside of the little box, so you get an accurate reading of the temperature of something. Most people are going to attach that probe somewhere on the tube of the telescope because the whole reason that we're running autofocus routines throughout the night is as the temperature changes, your scope is shrinking or expanding due to thermal expansion or contraction, and that's shifting your focus point. That's why we run autofocus as the temperature changes. So if you have a temperature readout, you can use Nina to trigger when to run an autofocus routine, because if you know your focus changes with temperature, that makes sense, right? However, there are other options to trigger when to run an autofocus. The one that I use, and a lot of other people use, is the star HFR. Basically, as you're tracking through the night, if your stars are getting bigger, then the software says, hey, your stars are getting bigger, let's run autofocus. And that works great. That's what I use all the time. And the reason to use that as your trigger is because if your stars aren't changing size, there's no reason to run an autofocus routine. However, you can get some false triggers if your star size is changing for other reasons, like if the seeing is getting bad or your guiding is getting bad for some reason, your stars might be getting bigger and you'll trigger an autofocus routine because of that. Or you can run both. Set it to run when the temperature drops by however many degrees affects your telescope. Some are very sensitive. I know like the Takahashi 106, some people have it set to like 0.5 degree Celsius or even less because it's super sensitive to thermal expansion and contraction. So you can set it to change with HFR if it's getting bigger, run an autofocus, and you can set it to change with the temperature drop. So really with one of them you're treating a symptom and one of them you're treating a cause, and they both honestly work pretty well. Now if you really want to dive in Nina you can actually set up something called temperature offset focus movements. And I'm not going to dive into how to do that, but basically you analyze how the focus position changes with temperature. There's a plugin for that. And then you can tell the focuser how much to move per degree step. And if you have a really consistent movement with the temperature, and you really trust it well, and you have a lot of data to support that on your scope through a wide temperature range, then you can basically have it just shift the focuser a teeny tiny bit as the temperature drops, and in theory you might never actually have to run another autofocus routine because it'll always keep those stars perfectly in shape. But again, that is really diving into the weeds of things here, but with Nina, you can actually do that on any focuser. It doesn't have to have it baked into the driver. Now this is actually something where I think the Q-Focuser has an advantage because it has such a high resolution. If you wanted to do that, you've got the teeny tiny little step sizes that may actually help make that accurate enough to be worth your while. So what's my final take on the QHY Q-Focuser? Honestly, I think it's a great little piece of gear. And an emphasis on little. This thing is microscopic. I think it's built really well. Over the couple nights that I was testing it out, that I was able to, it gave me consistent focus curves over and over. I love the fact that it has optional 12-volt power. I think that's great. It gets you the best of both worlds. I think about the coldest that I had this running was -20 or -25 Fahrenheit, and it did great. It didn't hesitate. So I think I'm going to give this my new and highly coveted Alaska seal of approval. So I've watched Queeve the Lazy Geek's review of the Q-Focuser, and I think he and I have pretty much the same conclusion. If you're in the market for a new autofocuser, this is the one to get. For $200, the price, the features, and the functions are all there. At the same time, if you already have a working autofocuser, there's nothing super compelling about this that would make it an upgrade over something you already have that works, unless you really value the super small size, or on the precision version, that manual override knob. Otherwise, just go with what you have, but if you are looking for a new one, this thing is great. That said, I may personally actually end up buying this from QHY, because by the time I get this thing uninstalled and reinstalled my old one, I might break even on what I can sell the old one for my effort. I just really like this piece of gear. If you're in the market for a new autofocuser, and you want to support the channel, and you like what you've seen with this product, I do have affiliate links down in the description for Agena Astro and High Point Scientific, two great astro retailers for all your astronomy related needs. So with that said, just remember to wear a coat because it very much is the middle of winter here. Nina! Come here! Come here! Good girl. Excellent.